Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Michael Roytman and Jay Jacobs. Gentlemen, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat with you. Jay and I, we've chatted, and I think I've hung out with you even at RSA at breakfast once. I think not this year, but the year before. And Michael, actually, when I was writing a book on vulnerability management, I had came up with a title. I'm like, oh, it sounds great. And then like little to find out, I'm like, oh wait, someone's wrote a book on this with this title already. So I was like, I can't use that. And I picked up Michael's book, and I felt like, wow, I'm not equipped to navigate the content in this book when it comes to my mathematical knowledge and expertise. But he wrote an incredible book as well on vulnerability management and data science, and really deep in the details, which I'm sure we'll touch on today. But for folks that don't know each of you, can you tell us a bit about your background as well as the team at Empirical? Maybe start with you, Jay.
Sure. Yeah, I am a data scientist. I have been in security for many, many years. And about 2010, I decided I was taking the path of risk analysis, and I had come to the realization that risk analysis is basically data analysis. If you do risk analysis correctly, it's using data. So I went back to school for statistics, and I studied, went into a master's program for statistics, and worked at Verizon on the DBIR doing a lot of the data analysis and data viz there, starting about 2010, 11, 12, 2015, I left there, but essentially been doing data science, data analysis, research into most aspects of security, and a lot of focus on vulnerability management and vulnerability exploitation. So that's where I am.
Awesome. How about you, Mike?
I am a PhD dropout out of Georgia Tech. I got the master's and bounced. Maybe had a little bit too much of a startup calling, but I joined Kenna Security very early on. And I was tasked with figuring out a data-driven approach to dealing with the slow vulnerabilities back in 2011, 2012. Some of that work was informed by Jay's work. So that's essentially how we met, is I aspired to be Jay. And fast forward, 15 years now, I went through the Cisco acquisition of Kenna about 3 years ago. I spent 3 years at Cisco as a distinguished engineer in AI/ML, working on software security products, ranging from vulnerability management to XDR. And about a year ago, took a step back from that and thought, who would I want to work with, and what are the hard problems? And all answers pointed to Jay.
That's awesome. It's funny you guys came back in contact and actually ended up starting a company together. So on that note, Empirical, what are you guys setting out to do? Like, what's your focus? What's your kind of niche in the market before we dive into the weeds of, CVE, CVSS, NVD, all the fun things like that? What are you guys up to over there?
So it came about because of our work on EPSS and the exploit prediction scoring system, for those who may not know. And what that model is doing, and it's out there, people can go grab the scores, it's OpenSig and things like that through FIRST. And with that, it just tries to measure the threat aspect on a global scale. Like, you pick a CVE and it's going to give you the probability of exploitation activity anywhere, in the next 30 days. And then people would say, how do I apply that? How do I bring that into my network? And I had two answers. I had the answer that I would do in my head, and then the answer that I could actually communicate to somebody else to try and do. And it was very difficult to try and communicate to somebody else, say like, oh, you just build a model, you get your telemetry, you get your asset, take this data, and you have to do all this work on the data and clean it and put it in a model, and then you got your answer, right? And that's very hard to communicate to people and to have them do it. And so largely that is what we want to do at Empirical. We want to take that global scoring of EPSS, the approach for that, and start to localize it, start to bring those models, bring the data more local, and to be able to produce vulnerability prioritization and management tasks that are localized and built on the intel that you have internally, as well as all the intel that we're able to collect.
Yeah, it makes sense. Anyone who's been a vulnerability management practitioner knows like the organizational context is always like the piece that's kind of missing from this whole conversation. And everyone's environment's unique, right? It's kind of a snowflake to some extent, for better or worse. So we'll dive into some of the localized stuff here soon. But we've seen a lot of focus, like you said, Jay, in terms of CVSS, EPSS, CAV. There's proprietary vendor kind of schemes out there as well. How do you guys kind of think about quantifying the effectiveness, of these these various frameworks and prioritization schemes that are out there in terms of seeing which one's more or less effective than one another. Like I'm sure there's a lot in there, especially for you guys who are deep into the data.
Yeah, look,
Yeah.
there's a really technical way to do it. I'll let Jay explain the more technical measurement of these, but I think in taking a very data-driven, measured approach to one strategy versus another and seeing this unfold at large enterprises in my time at Kenna and Cisco, what I realized quickly is that, one, all of the models that people deploy in cyber are really built at the vendor level, sometimes using customer data, sometimes not. But essentially, there's one model to rule them all, and it's applied to customer data, which is all good and fine, except that when you apply it to the customer's first question is, my data, my environment, my context doesn't look like everybody else's. How do I measure that difference? Which starts to get into maybe some things aren't relevant that you're using to baseline or measure systems against one another. Maybe there's only a subset of vulnerabilities that matters. Maybe there's mitigating controls that you're not accounting for in your system. And then I always had to answer that question when I was at Kenna with, well, we've built this model and here are tweaks that you can make to it. Here are adjustments you can make to it. We'll apply it to your data. And I think that a lot of vendors answer it that way. When we were starting Empirical, we started to think about how could we answer that question not in the most rigorous way possible, which is to say, what if we rebuilt the model from scratch per customer and it was just that customer's model? How would you measure the lift or increased effectiveness of that over a global model like an EPSS or the one that we sell or any other model realistically? And so the measurement is a very classical statistical approach to measuring a model. You've got an outcome that you want to prevent, in this case, exploitation activity. You can measure the efficiency of a particular strategy or the precision of it. You can measure the coverage or how many of the known bad are you removing from your strategy. But all of that assumes that that outcome is the same customer to customer, right? So the measurement is actually, we think, going to change if we're successful with this localized approach into a similar methodology, but a different data set used to measure each strategy against one another.
Yeah, and a little bit more technical, deeper dive on there, like Michael said, was basically we need feedback to measure the performance of a model. You need to have a feedback loop. And in the case of EPSS and some of our early local models, we're using exploitation activity. And so once you know the things that have activity that people are trying to exploit, you can say, hey, if I'm doing this strategy, how did it actually perform against the ground truth, the feedback loop? And so that's how we measure it. And, as we go against, like some people will look at what we're doing with EPSS and our internal global model and say, how do you compare to blah, right? Whatever this is, usually a vendor score or something like that. And my response is always like, well, how do they perform? Like, here's our charts, here's all of our metrics and how we perform. Go to your vendor and ask them for that, and then we compare these, and maybe we can talk about it that way. But generally, like, that doesn't exist, and so that's always a challenge to say, how do you compare to this? Well, they're not really showing their science here, so it's hard to compare, but yeah, I mean, we need to have that feedback loop.
Yeah, I was going to say, I almost think it doesn't even exist. If I was to think about the leading vulnerability management vendors in the world that I've worked with, their products, even startups, things like that, like they likely don't have those benchmarks of performance out there. And often I imagine in a sense, to protect themselves in the reputation of their product, is like they would defer to the customer, say, well, the customer is not doing X, Y, and Z, right? So it's not us, it's not our model. The customer is just not doing the right things or something like that.
That's actually really good. So the existence of that feedback loop is existential actually for these models in general. It's both the way to measure them, but it's also the way to construct them, right? The exploitation activity that we use to measure the model is actually how we train the model up. So one other thing that we're trying to do with Empirical is when you localize the models, like you said, that feedback data doesn't really exist except for at the customer, right? The customer usually owns that data. It might be CrowdStrike telemetry, it might be Splunk data, it might be application security findings, it might be incident reports that you submit to your insurance vendor. No one's sharing that with the vendor. Certainly nobody's sharing that with a vendor so that vendor can then use that to train a model or create a global model. So I think one of our hypotheses that we're now testing out is that you can go broader than vulnerability if you have a feedback source for application security, for cloud data, for even identity management data. But that feedback data exists specifically at the customer. So if you want access to it, the models have to stay at the customer as well.
Yeah, I
That's
think this is really fascinating how you guys are approaching it, and we'll jump to the localized piece again a little bit deeper in a moment. And it's interesting to me because it really will show the effectiveness or not of the way you're doing things. And historically, like I don't think most organizations even step back to even ask that question. They just keep doing. That's why like
right.
CVSS has perpetuated so long. Like CVSS base scores, it's like we just do this. This is what we do, or this is what
Yeah.
the compliance framework says we have to do. So we just do it. We don't know whether it's actually effective or not. That's why when
Yeah.
EPSS like burst on the scene and I looked at like the number of vulnerabilities that ever actually get exploited, I was like, holy shit, like this is all fundamentally broken. We're wasting so much time and resources. And no
Yeah.
wonder like the engineering and development teams hate us and avoid us. They're just wasting a ton of damn time, you know? And it's like the
Yeah.
whole, it's like rah, we're like a business enabler. And then you look at that, you're like, no, we're actually like an impediment, a major impediment on
Yeah.
the business. So stepping back a little bit, like looking at the ecosystem itself, like there was headlines, you know, earlier this year, you know, in recent months, even with CVE, it had some massive headlines with, you know, potential funding cuts, right, to MITRE and the CVE program. NVD's been struggling for well over a year, you know, kind of accruing a backlog of unenriched or unanalyzed like CVE data there. Now we have the EU vulnerability database spinning off, right? There's the rise of the CVE Foundation. You know, you guys have been real deep in the vulnerability management space for some time. Like, what do you each make of kind of what's happening here? What do you think is going to come in the years coming forward?
I so I so I get this question a lot actually, like, hey, if the CV program shut down or this or that, you know, like what's going to happen to you guys? And the real answer is like the same thing that's going to happen to everybody else, right? Like if the data goes away, we are going to have to adapt, right? We're going, people still have to make decisions and we still want to be there to support those decisions. So what are we going to do? And the answer is basically diversify data sources, don't put all of your eggs into one basket, you know, so expanding out, you know, start scraping GitHub security advisories, you know, all the security advisories, but, you know, OSV, you know, the JP cert, you know, their database, starting to get more and more data in. And then if something goes awry, it's going awry for everybody, right? And so we're all in the same boat. So I have a feeling like anything with the CVE program, it's going to even out. There's going to be some choppy water we're going to have to go through. I think we're going to see some splintering and some fracturing, but we're all in the same boat, right? So any model built on the data is going to probably take a hit, but so is every other decision framework, right? This is not, we're not like isolated in our own problem here with the challenges and all of the data being produced in the industry.
I want to point towards like a subset of this problem that will arise that I've been obsessed over lately. Um, so the reason CVE is so helpful is because it's essentially an index that everybody centralizes multiple data sources over. If you just think about it from a data perspective, you've got, you know, Adobe, Cisco, Microsoft vulnerabilities, and we know that they have these identifiers. That's the index we use for all those advisories. So then I can pick up that index and go to the advisory. We'll work backwards. The whole industry will, not just empirical, right? Like everybody from PCerts to enterprises to other vendors will all work backwards from advisories to the index. But the one thing that gets lost in that I think we'll need to get resolved through vendor to vendor communication is that if empirical then creates an empirical ID and has solved this problem, and then CrowdStrike solves the same problem, and then Bitdefender solves the same problem, and then Cisco solves the same problem, we've now got 4 different vendor IDs, which might be all good and fine if the vendors aren't interoperable. But if you remember RSA 2 years ago, everybody wants to be interoperable and open and XDR. So in service of that, which is the biggest market in cyber, right? The SOC XDR interoperability market. We're going to have to get together and have the vendors decide on what does an empirical ID mean for a CrowdStrike ID, and that's the downstream problem that I'm really thinking about. Although it's pretty downstream, right? We first have to solve the centralization of advisories problem.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting because as you said, there's kind of the source, the upstream, you know, with CVE and programmatic type stuff, but then there's downstream practitioners who are using these multiple different vendor tools and proprietary identifiers and scoring schemes, and it can be a real mess to untangle at the enterprise level too. So it's going to be interesting to see what comes of it. I think we are going to see a bit of a bifurcation, like to Jay's point, you know, that'll happen here. Maybe that adds to more resiliency in the ecosystem, but also it could make more unique challenges around the data and making sense of it all too. So it's good and bad.
Was that a
You know,
throwback to Resilient Cyber? Because that was very subtle, very good.
very, yeah, smooth. You caught me. You caught me. So I was going to ask you guys as well. Like, there's obviously like domain specific considerations too. Like when we look at like application security, cloud configuration management, things like that. And there's some vendors have created like cloud security advisory databases and kind of like things like that to lean into and resources. But how do we go about making more effective data driven decisions around these kind of nuanced environments and vulnerabilities, things like that?
Yeah, so I think that's going to be an interesting path forward because right now something like EPSS takes all the vulnerabilities and puts them into a big bucket and stirs it up and pulls the model out, right? But I think we do see different ecosystems of vulnerabilities and technology and exploitation activity in little pockets. Like you're talking about, AppSec is sort of its own thing, and cloud is its own thing, and OT and IoT, and you get all these sort of subdomains of ecosystems. And I think a path forward is to be like, hey, part of the problem right now is that you can't go to like cv.org and pick out all the OT vulns. You can't do that. So like part of the challenge is identifying them first. And once you start to identify them, and this is definitely on our roadmap, is to try and pick these out, maybe separate them out, maybe model them individually. See how does it look like for custom AppSec? How does it look like for OT? And really diving into these things and treating them like their own ecosystem and looking globally, looking more localized. I think there's a lot of really interesting paths to go down in that realm.
CV obscures a fundamental truth about some of these vulnerabilities, which is if I log into the database and I see 300,000 vulnerabilities that all have the same identifier, I might think they're the same, but they're not. They can be discovered in different ways. New technologies and different technologies find them in the IT AppSec example, for example, IoT AppSec example. And so the way that it's discovered on a network or in an enterprise might be the more important mechanism for classifying it than where it ends up or which vendor supplied it or who wrote about it or what the even EPSS or CVSS score is, right? And that mechanism of how does a customer find it ends up being the data source that you then use for the modeling. And some of them are interoperable, some of them aren't. Some of them are just modeling different things, right? Some are like, I know that this is an installed running application, so I think that this vulnerability is present. That's one way to detect it. Another one is I have root level access with an agent, so I actually know that this thing is truly vulnerable based on registry keys. Fundamentally different things. And that's nothing new. The network authenticated scan distinction has been around for decades, but it's obscured away sometimes by the data layer, unless you really double click into the data and try to pay attention to what's going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, again, it comes down to, it seems like that organizational level context is key as part of that consideration. And you talked, each of you have kind of mentioned like the different tools and things that, practitioners are juggling. And we've heard ad nauseum, like the single pane of glass. Like now I feel like we're kind of surrounded in a glass house with all the single panes that we have. What's the alternative of pushing for this like single pane of glass narrative? Like what's the alternative to this?
Why don't you take that one, Michael? Because you've got a great
so maybe this is just my aversion to the years and years of marketing of single pane of glass. But one of the things we started thinking about early on, before we informed the company, where we were just having conversations about should we do this, should we not, is how would you avoid having a single pane of glass as a security vendor? Because I think CISOs are tired of hearing that, right? It's lost its meaning the same way that when all vulnerabilities are high, none of them are high. When everything's a single pane of glass, then you don't have anything to look at. So we started thinking about how do you separate the data aggregation consolidation problem, which is what I think a lot of single pane of glass vendors are trying to do. I mean, in my previous life, I've tried to do this a couple of times to various degrees of success, from the decision support part of it. And finance is actually a really good proxy for this. You've got tools like Bloomberg, which aren't trying to give you a single pane of glass. They're trying to give you decision support data and analytics in the right place. You've got other tools that might be asset management, portfolio management tools, and you've got everything in between that might OEM each one of those and use them. But in security, we think, well, partially because security used to be a smaller problem and is now a bigger problem. Vendors tried to bite off a really big chunk. But there's enough there to specialize in each one of them. There's enough now, today, in 2025, where you could build an entire enterprise, an entire vendor around specializing in decision support and modeling an entire vendor around the dashboard data display portion, an entire vendor around the data lake portion, and an entire vendor around the business logic data consolidation portion. And we kind of know this intuitively. Practitioners know this because they'll point to a vendor and be like, they're really good at this. They also do everything else, but they're really good at this. And what that really means is that they have a core competency that that enterprise really sees as valuable, but maybe they don't have the time to do the other things because the security problem's gotten too big. So at Empirical, we've made the decision where we think our path forward is if we can deliver the best of breed models and then plug them into existing single panes of glass, let the customer decide what that may be, right? That might be a Databricks or Snowflake data lake. That might be ServiceNow or Exonius or Jira or any other security vendor. Let's put it where they need the decision support. And we are a decision support company, which I think is a little contrary to what you see on the showroom floor at Black Hat or RSA, where everybody says, log into our dashboard. Primarily, I think this comes from both Jay and I are tired of logging into dashboards ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's actually, I think it's, no, I think it's actually very smart. First off, you point to the real problem that like security companies tend to start out as point solutions and they have a core competency that they get proficient and great at. And then they try to push, you know, to be broader and have more features and capabilities and towards like being a platform, but they don't always do all the things well. And then often, like you said, everyone's trying to be the single pane or have another dashboard, or now we even have, you know, AppSec aggregation vendors that literally all they do is kind of bring everything together from all your disparate AppSec tools to make sense of it all. And I think you guys coming at it from the agnostic angle of being decision support and being interoperable with the other vendors puts you in a great position versus necessarily needing to compete with them. Like you're just here to help enhance the effectiveness and usefulness of these products, basically with more effective decision making. So that would resonate with me as a buyer if I was on the other end of you guys kind of coming in and speaking to me. And you guys have talked a lot about this throughout the conversation of this, you know, this localization, the organizational, you know, specific context. You know, can we dive into that a bit, both from the why? Like, I think it's kind of intuitive, like why that matters, like the organizational specific context, we know why it matters, but also the how, like, how do you guys do this? How do you go about creating these localized models for each organization? Because when I'm listening to it, I'm like, yeah, we absolutely need this. And I'm like, but doing that for all my customers at scale would be a nightmare, like trying to sustain that. So I'm curious, like the how as much as not just the why.
Let me talk about the scale part, and Jay will talk to you about the model part, which is actually the more difficult part, counterintuitively, right? The scale part's actually the easier part today. When we started Kenna 15 years ago, to build a machine learning model and deploy it was hard. It was a lot of custom code, a lot of feature engineering, a lot of data cleaning, and data cleaning meaning like some things go into a MongoDB and you're struggling with NLP. Some things go into a Postgres database and you really have to structure it right to make sure it works. And you have to check how one vendor structures it versus how you structure it. Fast forward to today, we've got a lot of data engineering and data science tools that allow us to almost terraform and spin up new models on the fly. There's, you know, billion-dollar companies built around data management that didn't exist 10 years ago. And for better or for worse, I think cybersecurity companies are a little later to the game in adopting some of the newer data engineering platforms because they're not fundamentally data engineering companies. They're data creation companies. They create a detection, they create a finding, they create a rule. So today the technology exists to build models, I don't want to say on the fly, but rather to train models in the same way that we now deploy infrastructure. The way you terraform infrastructure in the cloud, you can terraform models in the cloud. Feature engineering can be done in the cloud and shared across models or shared across data scientists, which also wasn't a thing before. Lots of data scientists used to just work in local environments themselves. But the key to this is that each enterprise is a unique snowflake, but the security problem is bounded. So if you told me, let's build local models for every business use case in the world, I would laugh you out of the room. But if we want to build local models for cybersecurity use cases, step one is determine what an important use case is. Because, you know, we can talk about AGI all we want, but EPSS outperforms all the large language models on prioritizing vulnerability because it's really purpose-built to just do one thing. So what are the things that you need to be good at? And then what is the known universe of data sources? And in cybersecurity, that's other vendors. Detections don't come from the sky. Detections aren't just like God-given CVEs. They are rather created by other security vendors and other rule sets, and even sometimes individual users themselves, the individual enterprises themselves. Once you have gone through all the permutations of that, how many vendors do enterprises really use? Maybe 200-300 consistently. Then you've got 200 factorial permutations of possible model inputs, and that's not that big of a number. I mean, it's a big number, but not for a data scientist. So from the scale perspective, there is now a path to solving it. I'm not saying we've solved it. I'm not saying we've built every permutation, but I think as we continue engagements with enterprises that have real data that's localized to them, we'll build up a repertoire of potential models to deploy, and then we'll be able to automate some of those deployments.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's really cool to see you guys leaning into this emerging technology and the capabilities that can be done now in cloud native environments with the models and things of that nature, because historically, it's kind of a tangent, but I feel like security is often, if you know the crossing of the chasm kind of context, like security is always a laggard and a late adopter, right? We're so risk averse, like what could go wrong? We never think like what can go right? Like what can we do if we're an early adopter and innovator with this technology? Meanwhile, the business is off, innovating and iterating and testing and experimenting, and like we're perpetuating that bolted on rather than building in security model that we hear so much about. But yeah, I want to give you a chance to weigh in your thoughts on that question.
Yeah. The why and the how, I think the why is pretty obvious, so like we want to move deeper into the modeling, right? So like, as I mentioned earlier on, like EPSS is just this external threat. How do we get deeper into the risk model and start to extract that data? And we want to make better decisions. That's the why, right? We want to make better prioritization decisions and better patching strategies, all that stuff. The how, I think, is really, really interesting. And part of the challenge, I think, in the marketing that we've done in cybersecurity, a lot of the marketing says, we've got it. Like, we are going to solve this problem. We will stop the next breach. We're going to do all that stuff. I think that's disingenuous. And I think most people know that's disingenuous, right? The reality is, and this is sort of working in our favor, that a lot of the prioritization strategies, especially in vulnerability management, is pretty weak. And this is sort of a dirty secret. Like when we talk to a company, when I was doing research at Scientia, we'd work with a company and every single company would be like, we're a little embarrassed about our data, actually, just to be honest with you, we're a little embarrassed. Like everyone says this, right? Whether they're in the data business or not, everyone's like, data is pretty messy. It's going to be terrible for you to look at, just to warn you. And give us data, and it was terrible. And we had to work through it and filter out all the signals and stuff. A lot of noise. And this is absolutely true. And so this is where we're starting. This is the how, right? We need to do better than basically, we're going to start with a random dice roll, right? This is our baseline, right? Now, if you take something like CVSS and you make that your strategy, you're going to get a little bit better, right? But what we want to do is actually talk about data. So like we're going to come into an environment, and the first thing we need is to know, hey, what vulnerabilities do you have? And just with that data, now we can start to localize models and say, all right, we just want to focus on these. We want to be able to tune to these types of vulnerabilities, these products, really do that. And we want to do it slightly better than what you're doing now. Hopefully a lot better, but at least focus on being better than what we were doing before. So this is a sort of a shift. We're not going to come out and say, hey, we're perfect, because they aren't. I mean, we're predicting the future, right? There is no perfect future prediction model. And so we're going to start out with, hey, we've got randomness. We're going to do better. We're going to do better than this. Now you want to, let's tie in your EDR, your XDR. Maybe we're going to get some things there, and that'll help tailor us even more. We're going to be improving on, the model that we just had before. Now you add in asset management. We're able to track assets. We can bring in sort of that asset criticality. Now we're getting even better models, and so that's how we're going to grow it. It's going to be an evolution depending on the data that you're able to bring in, if you're able to connect it. A lot of these might be siloed. You can have permission problems, So as we do this, as we evolve, we're going to evolve with the customer. The customer can say, all right, I'm going to start with this basic thing. I can connect this. Now I want to connect this. Let's bring that in. And the models are going to evolve and continually improve, trying to get closer to perfect. But in reality, I mean, like, we just have to improve on what's there now. What's there now is, as everyone probably will admit in secret, not that good.
Yeah, I was laughing as you were saying that because, literally, if it's an improvement of where we are now, we're abysmal when you look at like,
Yeah,
remediation rates and effectiveness and security in general sense, like it's pretty bad.
yeah,
So like there's only up from here. And like if we're using
right,
real data to drive those decisions, I imagine we could do exponentially better than we are now. And I like the fact that you guys aren't making, outlandish claims. It kind of
yeah,
speaks to your experience in the data and as a practitioner, knowing like, it's nonsense and like it doesn't
right,
resonate with experienced security leaders. They're going to laugh at that kind of thing,
right,
walking around RSA and see some of those marketing gimmicks that are out there.
yeah,
So we've kind of run the gamut of everything from CV, NVD, localized models, the proprietary scoring schemes and things like that. I have the website up here, empiricalsecurity.com. I think what you guys are doing is really cool, really innovative, and really promising. Where can folks learn more? Where should they be keeping an eye out for you guys? That kind of thing.
Website is the best place to learn more about us. We try to post a blog post in a research section there, which we're kind of modeling around. We don't want it to be a blog post. We want it to be just insights as we're building, not quite build in the open, but give you insights as we're building. We try to publish once a week there. But conferences will come up soon. And I think the most important thing is that as we are building these local models, we're just getting through our first cohort of enterprises that have signed up for design partnership. We're going to start releasing results of what local models look like. So I think, in the interest of being very transparent and honest about the effectiveness of these things, when we went into building local models, we were not sure when we founded the companies, we were not sure whether local models are going to outperform global models. That's a question that we had to answer through research and through the data. And I think we're going to start to answer that question publicly at conferences as we now have access to some of this data and are working with some companies.
Yeah, it makes sense. I think it's that level of transparency, as we talked about, is very uncommon, right? For vendors to kind of share
yeah,
their performance, and their theory and thesis. And also, I think if it's effective, you guys will have literally like the best advertisement you can. You can say, look, like the proof is in the pudding. We're showing you the outcomes of these experiments and these learning activities that we're doing with these models. So as I said, I really respect what you guys are up to, your backgrounds, and I followed both of you for quite some time now. I appreciate you guys jumping on and chatting with me.
great. Thanks for
But
having us, Chris.
likewise,
Absolutely. Take care,
hey,
guys. Or go ahead, Mike.
well, I was going to say, I really appreciate your crossing the chasm work that you've done and
Mhm.
the post that you've done about that. I think there's
Yeah.
something interesting I've been thinking about as I've been reading your work, which is the aversion to new technology adoption has kind of flipped itself with AI. Because on the one hand, it feels like AI is a new technology and all security teams want to adopt it. On the other hand, it's so risky from a security standpoint that one of the other answers to localization is I think we want to build these models so that people can adopt new technologies like ML and AI. If you think about throwing all your data into some open large language model and then getting decision support for cybersecurity, it's a non-starter. Right? That doesn't really work, and we don't know how effective that is. But that's the tendency of the chasm right now. The chasm has been flipped for CISOs because they need to adopt that technology, but they want to do it in a way that's safe. So that's one of the other things that we're thinking through is like maybe the reason that local needs to happen is for security's sake to make crossing the chasm a little easier for folks.
Yeah, I would agree with you there, especially, seasoned security leaders are thinking about it from that perspective of like we want to use these technologies, but we want to use it in a safe way that safeguards our data, right, from some of these model service providers and things like that. So I appreciate that, man. It's awesome to hear you're out there reading it too. Again, thanks so much for jumping on, guys. I hope you have a great
Yeah,
day.
thanks,
Thanks for
Chris. You
having
too.
us. Cheers.